and welcome to the Tennis Gallery Wimbledon. It's Wednesday the 23rd of May 2017 and I'm very pleased to say we've got Richard Evans here with us ahead of the launch of his autobiography, which is called The Roving Eye, and it also has a very long subheading which Richard will tell us.
A reporter's love affair with Paris, politics and sport. It's not too long, but anyway it sort of gives a little bit of a flavour of a book that covers a lot of different aspects of my life and all the weird things I've got up to. But it starts in Paris because that is where I was born. My father was a partner of Price Waterhouse in Paris, and we lived quite comfortably just off the Champs-Élysées and the Rue François Premier, and that's where I first saw the light of day. And unhappily something got in the way of the sort of paradise we were enjoying. It's called World War II, and the Germans who arrived, and we had to get out. We actually fled France rather late. We went to a place called Niort to start with, and then my father closed the Paris office, drove down and said, we're leaving, we're on a boat out of Bordeaux, and it was June 1940. Reputedly, there were rumours everywhere, but reputedly the Germans were 9 miles behind when we climbed onto this very ancient and once sunk coal boat. It had been sunk in the Spanish Civil War, and it was supposed to have a crew of 30, and we apparently were 300 refugees on board. And we set sail. I use the word euphemistically. I mean, we'd have done better if we had a sail, because we took apparently 4 nights to get from Bordeaux to Falmouth in Cornwall. And so we were refugees and spent the rest of the war in England. And my father got a different job working with Harold Macmillan, actually, at the Ministry of Supply. And we lived in the depths of the country at Shropshire, a place called Lentwardine, and eventually went back to Paris. Almost the first, I think we were the first British family resident back in Paris in 1945, and we lived off Red Cross parcels because happily they weren't needed anymore, and anything my father could extract on the black market. So that was the beginning of my life, and eventually I went off to be educated in England, in Sussex and Dorset. But I started thinking about journalism, I suppose, at Canford. Sat down with my mother one evening and she said, what do you want to do? And I thought about photography, and we were living in the Edgware Road, Park West, and I always used to go out and buy the Evening Standard every evening, and journalism fascinated me. And Richard, you'd be happy to know that I tested myself by writing a report just to see if I could do it at Craven Cottage, because it happened to be by then we'd moved to Putney, and it happened to be the nearest ground, although I was already an Arsenal supporter. So I went and watched, I can't remember, Fulham play someone in the days of Jimmy Hill and Bobby Robson and Johnny Haynes, who was one of my heroes, one of the great footballers of all time. And that stood me in good stead when I was introduced to Reg Hayter, who was running a sports service at the time. Just started, 2 partners, Ron Roberts and Freddie Garside. They'd formed this sports agency, and Reg had persuaded all the Fleet Street newspapers that instead of having to send their own reporters everywhere, he would cover matches for them. And so I found myself at the ripe old age of 17 covering Saracens versus Wasps for the Times. And I remember, I think I wrote it in longhand, took it back to Bridewell Place, and Reg looked it over, typed it up and sent it across the street to Printing House Square. So that was my first assignment.
Your career with Hayters was interrupted by national service.
It was. I was the last lot in. I think they took one look at me and decided that the whole thing should be stopped. So anyway, I went in and went to the desperate Whalley barracks in Brentwood in Essex. It had been condemned as unfit for human habitation in 1914, but there we were in 1958 habiting it, not very comfortably. Anyway, I survived all that, and I came out of the army on the Friday of Queen's, and in those days there was no gap, it was Queen's Wimbledon. And I was Reg Hayter, who, amazing man, he'd hired Tim Brown in my place, and he was under law, he had to take me back or find another job. And Tim was doing a very good job, he didn't want to fire Tim, so he went to Peter Goodall at the Evening Standard, which by then we'd switched offices and was in Shoe Lane, right next door. And he said, I've got this, very fine, and blah blah blah. And Peter Goodall said, well, that's good because Hilton Cleaver is 70 and he's retiring, and we need a rugby and rowing correspondent. So he agreed to take me on. So I walk into the Evening Standard on the Friday before Queen's in 1960, and expecting to go to Henley and do all this rowing, which I wasn't desperately keen on because I'm not really interested in rowing. And Charles Wintour, who was the father of Anna Wintour of Vogue, was the editor, and the previous year he had he had asked his literary editor, Harold Harris, who happened to be a tennis buff, if he wouldn't mind ghosting Althea Gibson's copy at Wimbledon. And Harold had done that and enjoyed it, but he went to Charles and said, listen, I've got an awful lot on my plate this year, so could you find one of your sports writers to work with Althea? And so as I walked into the building, Charles said to Peter Goodall, you've got this young man starting today, give him to Althea, which changed my life, because I'd never written about tennis. During the sort of 18 months I'd worked for Reg Hayter, it had all been football and cricket and rugby and bowls and all sorts of weird things, but I'd never done tennis. I'd followed it, of course, but I'd never written about it. And so I was told to go to the Queen's Club, introduce myself to this great Wimbledon champion, Althea Gibson, the first black person ever to win a title at Wimbledon, as she had done 2 years before. And we started off with me ghosting her copy for the Evening Standard. So that got me into tennis. And then eventually Bernard Joy, who was the last amateur to play football for England, just prior to World War II. He was the Evening Standard's football writer, but he was doubling up as their tennis writer. And it was just that period when football was encroaching on the whole year. And so Bernard eventually said to me, you know, I can't go on covering tennis in the summer because I'm always away on football tours. Shall I suggest to Peter Goodall that you become the tennis correspondent? And I said, yes please. So I didn't have to do rowing. And so I became the tennis correspondent as well as the rugby correspondent. And then eventually, during this period, I was lucky enough to catch the eye of a very nice lady who was working on the Londoner's Diary called Glenys Roberts. And we got married. So there we were in these relatively well-paid jobs, 2 young people, and we sat down one day and said, is this what we want to do for the rest of our lives? And it was a pretty momentous decision, and we decided that although we were enjoying it, we didn't. We wanted to explore new fields. We went to America. We rather startled rather startled Charles by telling him that we were leaving his wonderful newspaper, and it was a terrific newspaper in those days under Charles Wintour's editorship. And we got on a boat out of Southampton, the France, with not a great deal of money in our pockets, and set sail for New York, and that opened up a whole new period of my life.
Well, Richard, you're en route to America, and when you arrive, it's just at the start of a very sort of important period in tennis history.
Yes, I started doing all sorts of things when I got to America, not just tennis writing, but general reporting, and met a man who had another big effect on my career, John Gold, who was the evening news correspondent. But what I did for him wasn't going to keep me alive, even though I was doing some radio stuff for CBS. I needed to keep my contacts in tennis, and the man who helped me do it was the remarkable and unforgettable Ted Tinling, who was the great couturier and PR man and former umpire to Suzanne Longland. And he introduced me to another remarkable person called Gladys Hellman, who was publishing World Tennis Magazine, which was the magazine at the time. And she was looking for someone to write for her. Gardner and Lloyd was actually writing a lot of her stories, the Wimbledon doubles champion, who lived till over 100, died very recently, remarkable. Anyway, so I started writing for Gladys, and therefore, even though I became eventually a foreign correspondent for the Evening News in New York, I was able to maintain my tennis connections in a big way, which was good because, as you said, Richard, it was a momentous period for the game, with the eventual advent of open tennis in 1968, when Herman David decided to throw open the gates of Wimbledon to anyone of sufficient standard, and that threw the whole game into turmoil. The recalcitrant ITF had to, ILTF as they were then, had to follow suit because Wimbledon was so powerful they couldn't go against Wimbledon, and we were into the open tennis era. And I was, even though I was in America and later moved to Paris as a correspondent for the Evening News, I was able to come to Wimbledon every year and keep very much up to date and be involved with what was happening in the tennis world, which went on to develop into the big war between the newly formed ATP in 1972, the Association of Tennis Professionals, and their eventual boycott of Wimbledon, when the ILTF thought they could really keep control of the game. It was all about control of the game. The press in Britain tried to make out that it was a lot of money-hungry professionals trying to hold Wimbledon to ransom. That wasn't it. What they were trying to do was to wrest control of their sport from this bunch of amateur officials who just like wearing blazers and ties and giving away cups. And so we had the Wimbledon boycott in 1973, which was momentous, when almost 90 players withdrew on the eve of Wimbledon, which caused considerable chaos, as you might imagine. And they had to redo the draw, and all sorts of stuff went on. But I was very close to it all because I'd become great friends with Jack Kramer, Cliff Drysdale, Arthur Ashe, Charlie Pasquale. So I was following very closely what was going on and writing about it. And eventually the ATP, as it was, Donald Dell, who was the lawyer, Jack, and Arthur came to me one evening and said, listen, we took a bit of a battering over Wimbledon. Although we got what we wanted, we stopped the total control of the ILTF over our game, our lives. We need a PR man. So they hired me as a public relations officer, and very soon after that they gave me control over the Paris office, as it was. The office was really a cupboard in Benny Berthet's women's dress store off the Champs-Élysées. I could get my secretary, myself, and one visitor in, just if they came in sideways. Anyway, that was the ATP office in Paris, and I found myself in the interesting position of really having to professionalize all the European tournaments, which were almost exclusively run in country clubs like the Real Club de Barcelona and the Circolo in Florence, and try and persuade the tournament directors that no, they didn't have to charge the players for the towel anymore, and they should give them practice balls to practice with because they weren't going to steal them anymore, and this sort of stuff. And it was a process, and it was very interesting. For about 3 years I ran a few tournaments in far-flung places like Khartoum and Algiers and Cairo, and travelled around Europe a lot, and we sort of got the game professionalized to an extent. Then I had Jack left, unfortunately, Jack Kramer, and I didn't really get on with his successor, Bob Briner, who was a Texan, who was a very nice man, but somewhat limited in his vision of the world, and so we fell out and I left. And I went back to freelance writing and started, amongst other things, writing books.
obviously one thinks about your book about Ilie Nastase, your book with Ilie Nastase.
Yes, that I needed a bit of persuasion from a girlfriend of mine at the time called Gail Honeycutt, who was a very beautiful American actress who was living in London, and we had a relationship for a while. And I knew there was a book to be written about Nastase, and we were having a drink one evening, and she said, "Yes, go for it, you can do it." I'd already done a book with Marty Reeson, a very good pro, and that was fun to do. And I'd also written a rugby book, Winner Rays All Blacks. But writing a big autobiography, and not autobiography, a big biography of Nastase, who was a huge superstar at the time because of his personality as much as his genius with a tennis racket, was a big undertaking. Anyway, I decided to go for it, and I got Ilie's cooperation. I went to Bucharest, and he invited me to stay at his parents' house, and I ate far too much food because his mother wouldn't let us leave the table until we'd eaten everything. And I got to know Ilie Nastase very well. Of course, he's got a bad side to his character, which unfortunately has come out very recently in Bucharest with the Fed Cup furore. But he's a very generous man, a very funny man, and I wrote what I think is probably one of my better books. Actually, it was a good story, and he gave me all the material I needed, and that set me off. Went from there to write a book about another bad boy, John McEnroe. Originally, I wrote two books about him, but the first was A Rage for Perfection.
The John McEnroe book was very successful when it was first published, and it was revised and published again a few years later.
Yes, in 1989 I did an update called The Taming of the Talent, but the original book had been made possible because Peter Fleming, who I'd got to know quite well and was Mac's doubles partner, said, "We're going to have a hamburger at this coffee place on Park Lane one night." And McEnroe was 18, and he was very shy with adults. He was hopelessly shy, despite the fact that he exploded so spectacularly on a tennis court. And so I got to know him, and through Peter he started to trust me, which he didn't do with many people, and that led to the possibility of me working with him on a book about him. Yes, and as a result of spending time with John and getting to know him as a person, I realized there was a very sharp brain going on inside that curly head, which didn't really come out on the tennis court because all he was doing was ranting and raving. And so I thought it was interesting to write a book and show, or try and show the reader, that there was more to this man than a screaming maniac when he didn't like a line call. And that really didn't go down very well in America because the Americans were embarrassed by McEnroe. And I tried to show that he really was very intelligent, something that I think has been borne out since. And so it was a satisfying project, and it was even more so when I was able to embellish it a bit with the second version, The Taming of the Talent.
Richard, one of the books that you're very well known for is the Open Tennis, the first 20 years, and the subsequent update covering the first 25 years. Can you tell us a little bit about working on those books, please?
Well, I thought it was really important to get something down on paper about what did go on between 1968 and 1973 in particular, because that's when the whole game changed. And I'd been fairly intimately involved in writing about it and eventually working for the ATP. And I thought, you know, if somebody doesn't get this down on paper, the stories are going to get distorted every time I tell you a story. You're going to go and tell Bert a story, and then someone else is going to tell the story, and by the time it's been told 5 times, it's not going to be the same story. So I wanted to get it down on paper, and I think looking back, that was probably a useful thing to have done, because now we have something to refer to. How did tennis change? How did open tennis come in? Why was the Wimbledon boycott so enormous? And it's all there. I wrote it down, so that was satisfying.
Good, good. And what I'd like to do, as we draw towards the end, I'd like to talk about your broadcasting career. And if you could maybe run through for us the different organisations you work with.
I started by chance when I was very young, in my early years at Wimbledon. Somebody found me, and I really don't know who it was, from New York, CBS Radio, who had a 15-minute sports program nationwide every evening at 7:15. They wanted a report from Wimbledon, and they wanted a minute, and so I wrote a minute's transcript, and I started reading this in a broadcasting house studio at 11 o'clock at night, and that was really the start of my broadcasting career. Later on, I was listening to the output from BBC at Wimbledon, or at some tournaments before then actually, and I thought, without being unkind, a couple of the people weren't really that terrific, and I thought, well, maybe I can do better, being bumptious. And so I went to Slim Wilkinson, who was head of BBC Radio, and said, will you give me a go, see if I can do this, commentating. And he said, come down to Queen's, and I thought maybe someone might give me a little advice. No, you're on next. Christine's your summariser, off you go. So stone cold, I was behind a BBC microphone commentating on a match at the Queen's Club, and apparently it worked, because I started a 20-year career as BBC radio commentator at Wimbledon. With a year, I did television for a year, but it was mainly radio, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and had some amazing people to work with, one of whom was Fred Perry for several years. Probably my most consistent summariser was Fru McMillan, the great doubles champion, and a whole host of other people I worked with, including Peter McNamara and Michael Steek, and all the BBC professional commentators who were such great colleagues. That was an enormous part of my journalistic career as well as radio career. And then I went on and did other things. More recently, having formed Tennis Radio Network with 3 colleagues, we do the online radio commentary on the Australian Open, ball by ball, every match. And we also work for Tennis Channel, their Mosaic feed, where you can choose by tapping the screen in America to choose which court you want to watch. So during Roland Garros we do that, and I've done various other things, a bit for TalkSport too, so I just keep my hand in. It's something that I've always found rewarding and fun, and I'll continue to try and do it.
Well, thank you, Richard. That leads me very nicely into a question, which is this. If you had to name the greatest player you've ever seen or commented on over your career, who would that be?
Well, until a certain gentleman called Roger Federer arrived on the scene, it was Lou Hode, the great 1956-57 Wimbledon champion from Australia, who had every shot in the book. He was probably one of the strongest men ever to play tennis. But then Roger Federer came along, and I must admit he is, for a variety of reasons, racket skill, movement, style, ability to play on all surfaces, because remember, he can play very well on clay. He won Hamburg 4 times, he's won Roland Garros. It's only Nadal that's kept him a little bit in the shadow as far as clay is concerned. Roger Federer, as far as I'm concerned, has it all, and his start to 2017 has been sensational, winning the Australian Open to his amazement. He wasn't expecting to after 6 months off, and then going on to win Indian Wells and Miami, and I will be happily surprised if I ever see a better player than Roger Federer.
I'm sure a lot of people who are watching this film would agree with you about that. I certainly would. And what would be your favourite tournament of the ones you've been to?
It is such a hopeless question, because you know, I love so many tournaments. 3 of the slams, with due respect to the US Open, which has improved enormously, the 3 slams really reflect their locations. Wimbledon is so British, Roland Garros is so French, and the Australian Open is a great Aussie sporting festival, and they're all wonderful. I think Wimbledon would be right up there, and the other one that's coming up on the rails and will be one of the great tournaments, if it isn't already, is Indian Wells in California. It's owned now by Larry Ellison, who's pouring money into it, and Ray Moore behind the scenes looking after the Indian Wells Tennis Garden is making sure that it just gets better and better each year, and it really is a fantastic event.
Thank you. And as we're here in Wimbledon, this is the very final question today. We'd like you to tell us if you remember the very first time you went to Wimbledon, when that was, and anything that stands out in your mind about your first visit to Wimbledon.
Well, having been assigned to Althea Gibson by the Evening Standard editor Charles Wintour on the Friday of Queens, I suddenly found myself totally unexpectedly thrust into the tennis world, and I walked through the gates at Wimbledon for the first time on day one in 1960 and sat next to Althea Gibson in the commentary box and wrote her copy. And it was the year that Neil Fraser won, the great Australian left-hander, beating Rod Laver, who'd actually lost in the final the previous year to Alex Olmedo. So Rod Laver hadn't quite arrived, and Maria Bueno, I think it was, graceful, beautiful Brazilian, won the women's singles, and I was just wrapped up in this amazing atmosphere of Wimbledon, which is so similar today. Obviously it's changed in many, many aspects, but I remember Wimbledon, as it was, as it is, just this unique sporting occasion.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. That's been wonderful. Richard's book, The Roving Eye, will be out on the 20th of June. That's just in a few weeks' time. We urge you all to go out and get a copy immediately, and it's a wonderful read. And thank you for coming, Richard.
Richard, thank you very much. Pleasure.